The town of Caldwell Crossing woke the way it always did, with the crowing of roosters, the smell of wood smoke drifting from kitchen chimneys, and the creak of the mill wheel turning lazy circles in the creek. It was a Tuesday in late October, 1857, and the air had that particular quality of autumn in the Georgia lowlands, honeyed and brittle at once, like the last page of something you didn't want to finish. What the town did not wake to, for the first time in 11 years, was the sound of Moses. Moses had no surname on any document. He was listed in Harlan Pruitt's ledger as Moses, male, age approximately 34, field capable, domestic services as needed. But the people of Caldwell Crossing, white and black alike, those who owned and those who were owned, all knew him differently. They knew him by the sound of his voice moving through the pre-dawn dark, the low wordless hum that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath his ribs, filling the empty streets before any lamp was lit, before any window was opened. It was a sound like the earth thinking. Each morning, Moses walked the 2 miles from the Pruitt plantation to the town square, where he would sit on the bench outside the general store and wait to be assigned the day's errands. He carried things, mended fences, hauled water, split wood, ran messages between households, the invisible machinery that kept the town's visible life running smoothly. He was a fixture as much as the courthouse weather vane or the rusted pump at the edge of the square. People built their mornings around the certainty of him. So when Constance Hale opened the shutters of the dry goods store that October morning and looked out at the bench, truly looked the way you only look when something is wrong, and found it empty, she did not immediately understand what she was seeing. She blinked. She looked again. The bench sat in pale morning light, its oak planks worn smooth by years of him, and it was profoundly, impossibly unoccupied. She stood there for a long moment. Then she closed the shutters without saying a word to her husband. By 9 o'clock, word had moved through Caldwell Crossing, the way fever moves through a household, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Harlan Pruitt had ridden into town with a look on his face that men in his position only wore when something valuable had been lost. He dismounted at the sheriff's office, hitched his horse, and went inside. He was there for 40 minutes. What passed between Pruitt and Sheriff Dade, no one outside that room would ever fully know. But people saw Pruitt emerge, and they noted, because people in small towns note everything, that he didn't look the way a man looks when he expects a problem to be solved. He looked the way a man looks when he has begun to understand, somewhere in the back of his chest, that something has already happened and cannot be unhappened. He had discovered Moses gone at 4:30 in the morning, when the field bell had rung and Moses had not appeared. This was unusual. In 11 years, Moses had never missed the bell. When Pruitt had gone himself to the small cabin behind the smokehouse, he found the door open, the straw pallet pushed to one side, a single tin cup sitting on the floor, as if carefully placed there. No other sign of departure, no note. Moses could read and write, a fact Pruitt had known and looked the other way about, because useful men are allowed their quiet dangers. No note, only the cup, only the open door, only the morning air moving in where a man used to be. Sheriff Dade sent 2 men north along the road and 2 south. He sent another to check the river crossings. He dispatched a boy to ride to the neighboring county to alert their sheriff. All of this was procedure. All of this was expected. And as it was done, The town of Caldwell Crossing went about its morning in a hush that no one had announced, but everyone observed. The mill kept turning. The Métis blacksmith kept at his anvil. Children were walked to the schoolhouse. But something had shifted in the quality of the air, the way it shifts before a storm. Not the storm itself, but the knowing of the storm, the held breath of the world before it arrives. There are things that towns carry without speaking of them directly, the way people carry grief, present in every room, acknowledged nowhere. Moses had come to the Pruitt plantation when he was 23, brought from a sale in Savannah along with 2 others. In the early years, he had worked the fields. Then Pruitt, who was a practical man above all else, had recognized what everyone eventually recognized about Moses, that his particular intelligence was wasted in the rows. He had a memory like a lockbox. He could navigate the social complexities of the town with a fluency that Pruitt himself lacked. He knew which merchant was feuding with which neighbor, which wife needed her fence mended before her husband noticed it, was broken, which family needed the message delivered gently, and which needed it delivered plain. He was, in every sense that mattered, and in every sense that was never acknowledged, the connective tissue of Caldwell Crossing. Over 11 years, he had accumulated a kind of invisible capital. Not wealth, which he was forbidden, but something almost more durable, the accumulated weight of having been essential to everyone. Every family in town owed him some quiet debt. He had sat with Margaret Fowler's mother through the night she died, because Margaret had asked him, and because he had come. He had found the Hale boy when the child had wandered into the woods and been lost for 2 days. He had taught Obadiah Green's son, in secret, in stolen minutes, the shapes of letters, because the boy had a hunger for them, and Moses remembered what that hunger felt like. He had given and given and given, and the town had taken and taken and taken, and now he was gone, and the town stood in its own silence and tried to find a way to speak about this that did not require it to understand what it had done. There is a detail that the official record of that day would later omit, partly because no one thought to write it down, and partly because it was a detail that raised uncomfortable questions. 3 of the women in Caldwell Crossing, Constance Hale, Margaret Fowler, and a woman named Ruth Dade, who was the sheriff's wife, each independently declined to join the small groups that formed through the afternoon to discuss the search. They did not decline loudly or with any drama. They simply found reasons to be elsewhere, to be busy, to have something pressing that required their attention. Ruth Dade spent the afternoon in her garden, pulling up the last of the autumn squash, with a focus that her daughter later described as strange, even frightening. The focus of someone who needed her hands to be occupied so her face would not have to do any work. Constance Hale sent her husband to the discussions alone and told him she had accounts to balance. She sat at her desk and opened the ledger and looked at the columns of numbers without seeing them. Margaret Fowler went to the church, which was empty on a Tuesday afternoon, and sat in the 3rd pew from the front, the same pew she had occupied on every Sunday of her adult life, and folded her hands in her lap. The minister found her there when he came to prepare for the following Sunday's sermon. She told him she was praying. He nodded and left her alone. He had his own complicated feelings about the day, and prayer seemed as useful as anything. None of these women would ever speak directly to each other about what they felt. But there is a particular quality to the silence between people who have arrived at the same wordless understanding, a kind of resonance, like a tuning fork set vibrating in an empty room. You feel it even if you cannot name it. What they felt, or something like it. A man had chosen freedom with such precision and such patience that by the time anyone noticed, he was already gone. And what that choice said about the years he had spent here, the labor, the smiles, the service, the 1,000 daily accommodations of a life lived in chains, was something the town would have to find a way to not think about for a very long time. The search parties returned at dusk with nothing. The road north had yielded no sightings. The river crossings were clean. The neighboring county had not seen him. He had not passed through the Indian trails to the west. Or if he had passed without leaving a trace that anyone could read. What they found instead, discovered late in the afternoon by one of the men checking the creek road, was a small piece of cloth caught on a fence post about 1.5 miles outside of town, in the direction of neither north nor south, but west-northwest, towards the mountains. The cloth was blue. Moses had been known to wear a blue work shirt, but the fence post marked the edge of a farm that abutted a dense stand of old-growth forest, and beyond that forest was a ridge, and beyond that ridge was territory that grew complicated quickly, streams, hollows, Indian paths, routes that a man who had walked this land for 11 years and had excellent reason to pay careful attention to its geography might know extremely well. The sheriff looked at the piece of cloth for a long time. His deputy waited. A second deputy stood a few feet away, examining something on the horizon with great interest. "We'll resume at first light," the sheriff said, and then he turned his horse and rode back toward town. There is no record of a resumed search the following morning. There are records, Pruitt filed them, of the financial loss, of the reward boasted, of the letters sent to slave catchers in 3 counties. These documents exist. What also exists in the same archive, tucked in without comment among the official correspondence, is a single piece of paper that appears to be a draft of a letter that was never finished or sent. The handwriting belongs, based on comparison with other samples, to Sheriff Dade. It reads in full, "I have been in this office 14 years, and I have done what the law required of me in all matters, and I do not apologize for my service. But I find myself tonight unable to..." That is where it ends. The rest of the page is blank. There was a boy in Caldwell Crossing named Elias Pruitt. He was Harlan Pruitt's youngest son, 12 years old that October, at the age when the world is constantly explaining itself to you in ways you don't yet have language for. Elias had grown up alongside Moses in the particular way that white children on plantations grew up alongside enslaved people, in proximity, but with a vast and carefully maintained distance between them that everyone was expected to observe even when it made no natural sense. He had played in the dirt yard near the cabins when he was small, before his mother put a stop to it. He had ridden on the wagon beside Moses 100 times, listening to Moses hum. Moses had, on one occasion, grabbed Elias by the collar and pulled him back from the edge of the creek when Elias had come too close and the bank had given way under him, had saved the boy's life with the casual competence of someone who is always watching, always aware, because awareness is what survival requires. Elias had said afterwards, "Thank you, Moses," and Moses had said, "Watch your step, boy," and that had been the whole of it. The night Moses disappeared, Elias lay in his bed in the upper room of the Pruitt house and stared at the ceiling. He could hear his father pacing downstairs, the low, angry murmur of his voice as he talked to himself or to the darkness. He heard his mother's soft attempts to calm and his father's failure to be calmed. Elias thought about the creek bank. He thought about the moment the earth gave way, and the moment the hand closed on his collar, and the moment he was on solid ground again, heart hammering. He thought about the word slave, and the word property, and the word freedom, and how they all existed in the same world as that hand on his collar, as Moses' voice saying, "Watch your step," as the sound of someone humming before dawn, like the earth thinking. He did not have the words for what he understood that night. He was 12, and the understanding lived somewhere below the level of words, in the body, in the gut. But later, much later, in a different century of his life, he would write about it in a letter to his daughter that became, in its way, one of the small documents of that era. I understood for the first time that a man had been among us who was more than we had allowed him to be. And I understood, though I couldn't have said it then, that his leaving was not a theft of property. It was a man reclaiming what had always been his. What frightened me, and what I think frightened the whole town, though no one would say so, was not that he had gone. It was that he had chosen to go so absolutely, so silently, so completely, that there was nothing left for us to hold on to, not even his anger. He had taken everything with him, including that. He left us nothing but our own reflection. The bench outside the general store sat empty for 3 days. On the 4th day, a drifter named Coulter sat on it for an afternoon, and people found reasons to walk past the store more than usual, not to look at him exactly, but to confirm to themselves that the man sitting there was someone other than Moses, that the world had continued, that the bench had been reoccupied and was therefore ordinary again. But ordinary was not quite what it became, not immediately. There is a way that absence reshapes a space, not forever, not even for very long in most cases. People are adaptable, and towns are especially good at smoothing over disruption. But for a time, the bench held the shape of him. People passed it and felt something they would not name. A slight hesitation in the step, a glance, then a glance away. The uncomfortable intimacy of a place that has held someone and now holds the memory of them. 2 weeks after Moses' disappearance, Constance Hale had the bench painted, a fresh coat of dark green paint, which she announced was simply for the sake of upkeep, which was true, and which everyone understood to mean something more than upkeep, which was also true. The paint covered the wear patterns his years of sitting had left in the wood, the slight depression where his hands had rested, the ghost of his weight in the grain. The paint was the town's way of saying, "This is done now. We are moving forward. We are not going to keep sitting with this." Most of the town accepted the green paint as the conversation ender it was meant to be. A few could not quite accept it, and lived with that inability quietly, the way people live, with the things they cannot explain or resolve, carrying it around, finding it in their hands at unexpected moments, putting it back down. This is not a guess. There are records, other kinds of records, kept in other kinds of ledgers, by people who ran other kinds of operations. That document a man named Moses, who appeared at a station in eastern Tennessee 3 days after the October disappearance, traveling alone, on foot, in remarkably good condition for a man who had covered roughly 90 miles of mountain terrain in 72 hours. He had planned it for 2 years. He had memorized the route from maps he had seen, As a man who ran errands, he entered every kind of room, and he had excellent reasons to look at everything carefully. He had packed nothing that would be missed. No food, no clothing, only a small packet of letters he had written and addressed to people in the town. He had sealed them and given them to a man, another enslaved man on a neighboring property, with instructions that they not be delivered for 2 weeks. No one in the official record mentions these letters, which means either they were delivered and their recipients chose not to speak of them, or they were never delivered at all. But 3 of them survived. One was found in a trunk belonging to Margaret Fowler's estate, discovered by her grandchildren decades later. Another turned up, improbably, in the papers of a northern abolitionist, donated to a university archive. The third was kept, its recipient unknown, but eventually found its way into a historical society's collection. The letter to Margaret Fowler, which is the most complete, reads in part, "I do not write this to cause you pain or to accuse you of anything that was not already known between us in the silence we kept. I write it because I want there to be a record, somewhere, written in my own hand, that says, I was here. I was a person with a person's full interior life, a person's capacity for love and anger and humor and grief. I was not what the ledger says I was. And I go north, not running from you, but running toward myself, which is the only destination I have ever truly wanted." He reached Canada in December. There is a record of a man named Moses Caldwell. He had given himself a surname, which is its own kind of declaration, arriving in Ontario and presenting himself to a community of free black settlers there. He worked as a teacher. He taught children to read. He lived, as far as the records show, for another 31 years. He died in 1888, age approximately 72, and was buried in a small church cemetery in a town that no longer exists. His grave marker read, "Moses Caldwell, born in bondage, lived in freedom, he chose. Caldwell Crossing went quiet, not because it was mourning Moses. It was not permitted to mourn him, not in any form its residents could acknowledge. It went quiet because his absence had opened a door into a room that the town had kept, locked and had preferred to keep locked. A room full of questions that did not have comfortable answers. Who had benefited from his labor? Everyone. Who had enjoyed the services he rendered? Everyone. Who had smiled at him, made small talk with him, given him the minimum of human regard that felt like decency without actually being decency? Almost everyone. And who had understood, even dimly, even in the margins of their thinking, that what they were doing and what they were participating in was something that could not survive a full, clear examination? The silence was the sound of that examination beginning, and of most people choosing not to let it finish, because that is what silence is sometimes. Not the absence of understanding, the presence of it, trapped, unable to speak itself, because the speaking would cost too much. Moses had known this. He had lived inside their silence for 11 years and had understood every layer of it. The silence that said you are useful, the silence that said you are not quite real, the silence that said we know what this is and we cannot say it. He had kept his own silence too, a different kind, the silence of someone planning, someone watching, someone who has decided that dignity is not given but taken, not awarded but claimed. And when he was gone, his silence came with him, and what was left behind was theirs, the town's own silence, suddenly unmasked, with nowhere left to hide. The Civil War came, emancipation came, The town changed in the ways all towns changed, slowly and unevenly, and with enormous resistance, and also in ways that were quieter and stranger, and less recordable. Elias Pruitt grew up and moved north himself, to Cincinnati, then to Philadelphia, then eventually to Chicago, where he worked in a newspaper office and wrote, carefully and over many years, about the things he had seen as a child. His account of Moses' disappearance, published in a small abolitionist journal in 1872, is the primary source historians have used to reconstruct the events of that October Tuesday. He wrote, I have spent many years trying to understand what happened in Caldwell Crossing the morning that bench was found empty. I think what happened was this. A man told us the truth about ourselves without saying a single word. He simply left, and his leaving was the most eloquent statement I have ever witnessed. It said, I was never what you told yourselves I was. I was always this, a man whole, capable, with somewhere to go and the will to get there. The only thing that kept me here was force, and when the force could be outwitted, I outwitted it. Good morning, goodbye. Ruth Dade, the sheriff's wife, died in 1874. Among her effects was a small journal, mostly domestic in content, shopping lists, weather observations, notes about her garden. Near the back, in handwriting that becomes increasingly small and compressed, as if trying to fit more truth into less space, there are 2 pages of reflection. They do not mention Moses by name. They mention the question of what we owe each other and the things I have not said to anyone, including myself, and the morning the bench was empty, which I think about more than I should, more than is probably natural, though I have come to believe that what feels like too much may actually be exactly the right amount. The bench itself, the green-painted bench outside the general store, stood in the Caldwell Crossing town square until 1931, when the building was demolished to make way for a wider road. No one thought to save it. These things rarely get saved until it is too late to save them, and then we wonder what we were thinking. Somewhere north of the Georgia mountains, in the autumn of 1857, a man named Moses walked through the night with his whole life in his chest and nothing else. No pack, no map he needed to carry, because the map was already memorized. No fear that was stronger than the thing he was walking, Tophet. The stars were probably out. The air was probably cold. The leaves were turning on the ridges, that fire of orange and red that the mountains make before they let everything go and rest. He walked through it and through it and through it. And when morning came, he was somewhere new, and the day was his, and he was his own. And that was everything. That was the whole of what he had ever wanted. And back in Caldwell Crossing, the bench sat empty in the early light, and the town stood at its windows and looked out at the square, and could not quite find the words for what it was seeing, and so it said nothing at all. Some silences, once made, take a very long time to end.